Addendum Chapter 13.2. The COVID virus evolved over the epidemic to be much less deadly, much less lethal than the flu. Any competent biologist would have been highly confident that the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 would, over the course of the epidemic, evolve to become more contagious and less deadly. And that is exactly what happened. The virus has an evolutionary interest in spreading or being more contagious, so one would expect that would happen, but also expect that it could not get more contagious than the common cold. Coronaviruses cause the common cold, and cold viruses have had millions of generations to evolve to be as contagious as possible. So it's easy to predict that SARS-CoV-2 would never get more contagious than the common cold, and it has not. The virus does not have any evolutionary interest in being deadly. It just wants to reproduce. It does not care whether it kills us. Since lethality is not an evolutionary aim, basic evolutionary theory predicts that the virus would become less lethal but more contagious as it evolves. That is exactly what has happened. The CDC was eager to say that each new strain of the virus was more contagious than the previous, but to this day has not admitted that the newer strains are less deadly than the previous strains. They would say, the new strain is even more contagious than previous strains and could be more lethal. It's too early to know. That was nonsense. Everyone could see that a lower percentage of infected people were dying over time and not just due to vaccination. But for some reason, the CDC and other powers that be did not want to admit that. They wanted to maintain fear and hysteria and justify their restrictions. The reality was that the Omicron strain, the most prevalent strain in about November to December 2021, was 4.2-fold less likely to lead to hospitalization and at least 6 times less likely to lead to death once a patient is hospitalized than the Delta strain, which was itself a bit less deadly than the original strains. That makes Omicron at least 24-fold less lethal than the original COVID strains, which were themselves only 1.7 times more deadly than the flu. That makes the Omicron strain 1/14th as deadly as the flu, or about as deadly as the common cold. 1.7 divided by 24 equals 1/14th. I arrived at that result from the 2 papers below. Ferguson et al., reference 1, gives data from the British Health Service on the PCR tests of every person infected for COVID from November 29th to December 11th, 2021 in the UK. The PCR test shows not only whether they are infected, but also whether they are infected with the Omicron strain, designated S-, or another strain, probably Delta. The key data for me is this, in this table. If you are infected with Omicron, you are 4.2 times less likely to be hospitalized than if you are infected with another strain. That is actually a lowest limit on the magnitude of the difference, because people infected with Omicron have milder illness and are more likely to be asymptomatic, so they are less likely to go in for a PCR test. If you are entirely asymptomatic, you will not go in, and if your symptoms are mild, you are less likely to bother to get tested. Another data point caught my eye in this paper, which suggests to me that the main evolutionary advantage of Omicron over Delta is that it is better at reinfecting people who were previously infected, meaning it is better at evading immunity from prior infection, which would make sense because prior infection was with a different strain and your immunity would be best against that same strain. The reinfections are only 10% of the Omicron cases, so 90% of the people who contracted it were not previously infected with COVID, and still only 0.15% of them were hospitalized. So the decreased hospitalization risk of Omicron is not due to infecting only previously infected people who have partial immunity. It is an inherent decreased lethality. The second paper I turned to in order to calculate the lethality of Omicron compared to previous strains is Maslow et al., reference 2, published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, with data from South Africa. Look at the bottom line of deaths. The death risk of hospitalized patients is 2.7% in the Omicron wave and was 25.5% last year in the earlier wave, 9.4-fold lower for Omicron. Since 66% of patients in the Omicron wave were unvaccinated, even if all the deaths occurred in unvaccinated persons, the risk of death in the Omicron wave would still be 6-fold lower than in the previous waves. And that can be viewed as the lowest estimate of the difference because not all of the patients in November and December 2021 had Omicron. If some had Delta or a previous strain, they would have a higher risk of death and might account for some or even all of the COVID deaths in the time period of the Omicron wave. Also note that all the other risks were significantly lower in the Omicron wave. More than 4-fold less risk of needing oxygen therapy, half the risk of intensive care admission, and less than half of the time in the hospital. The Ferguson paper did not report deaths, perhaps because there were no deaths with Omicron, but the relative infection fatality rate would be equal to relative risk of hospitalization times the risk of dying from COVID once you are hospitalized. Ferguson's data shows 4.2-fold lower risk of hospitalization, and Maslow's data shows over 9-fold lower risk of dying once you are hospitalized. Relative infection fatality rate of Omicron versus Delta is then 4.2 times 9 equals 38-fold lower. Another way to look at this is the ratio of deaths to cases over time as the Omicron variant has become more common. These numbers are from worldometers.info/coronavirus. In the UK, only about 7% of COVID cases were from the Omicron variant from November 19th to December 11th, 2021. In October, no cases were Omicron. By January 1, if 100% of cases were Omicron, then this ratio that Omicron is 4.3-fold less deadly would be correct. But if only 10% of cases were Omicron, which is probably closer to reality, it would be more like 43-fold less deadly. For South Africa, the numbers in their 3 most recent waves were as shown in Table 6 below. Each of these dates represents a peak of COVID cases and deaths corresponding to the Beta, January 15, 2021, Delta, July 15, 2021, and Omicron, December 15, 2021, strains of the COVID virus, reference 12. South Africa is the best nation for this data because it is the one with the highest percentage of Omicron cases. By December 15, 2021, the majority of their cases were Omicron, reference 2. But not all were, so these ratios can still be viewed as low estimates of the ratio of lethality of Omicron to earlier strains. The lower lethality on December 15th than the earlier dates could partially reflect higher vaccination. But according to reference 4, as of January 1, 2022, about 25% of South Africans were fully vaccinated, and fewer than a quarter of those, or about 7%, were vaccinated by July 15, 2022, reference 4. So the vaccination rate does not have a huge effect on this data. Perhaps the ratio of 18-1 in lethality of Omicron versus Delta should be cut at most by 25% to about 14. The original strain of COVID was only 1.7 times more deadly than 1.7-fold higher infection fatality rate than ordinary influenza if you have not been vaccinated against either. So if Omicron is even 4-fold less deadly than the original strains, it is less than half as deadly as influenza. More likely it is at least 10 times less deadly, and by one calculation above 38-fold less deadly. In any case, we have little, if anything, to fear from the Omicron variant. It is far less deadly than the flu and maybe no more deadly than the common cold. Conclusion. In any rational world, the fact that Omicron is far less deadly than the early strains of COVID and far less deadly than ordinary influenza would be greeted as great news and as a reason to declare that there is no reason not to go back to normal life. But that is not how our leaders have reacted to this. Instead, they latched onto it as an excuse to reinstate restrictions. For some reason, they seem to be desperate for an excuse to continue the lockdowns and the restrictions.